for this talk is Where Have All the Radicals Gone? And I think I agreed to do this talk last spring before I became part of the dean's operation. So I don't think I had anything ulterior in mind. And it isn't the case that radicals go into the dean's office, because I've been there for a couple of weeks and there's nothing radical about that office at all. It's very quiet. But it is interesting to think about the 50s and the 60s and consider that period of time with the question, where have all the radicals gone, in mind. Most, if not all of you, remember, vaguely or not so vaguely, people such as Eldridge Cleaver, Rennie Davis, Bernadette Devlin, Che Guevara, Tom Hayden, Stokely Carmichael, Carl Oglesby, Jerry Rubin, Clarence Sills, and a host of others, Martin Luther King. Some of you remember Lenin and Marx, who cross over many, many eras. It was an age which was remarkable for the amount of vitality that characterized the activities of the time in a number of areas. In Containment and Change, Carl Oglesby characterized the rebels of the period in the following fashion. Containment and Change was published by Oglesby in 1967. The rebel is an incorrigible absolutist who has replaced all problems with the one grand claim that the entire system is in error, all solutions with the single irreducible demand that change shall be total, all diagnoses of diseases with one final certificate of death. To him, total change means only that those who now have all power shall no longer have any, and all those who now have none, the people, the victimized, shall have all. That Oglesby statement captures a number of the nuances of this particular period in which radicalism ran rampant. It expresses some of the nobility of the era, the desire to serve the people who have been victimized by overwhelming powers, the desire to return justice and power to those that rightfully should have it. It also expresses something which was disenchanting and difficult to accept about the era, namely the strong absolutism that characterized much of the radical movement, especially in the area of political revolution. There was no giving, there was no compromising. The other side was completely wrong and our side was completely correct. In the area of politics, and especially the politics of social systems, there were a number of characteristics in the period which were disturbing and at the same time attractive. It's during this time that Nazism has its rebirth. It's during this time that fascism has its rebirth. It's during this time that anarchism has its rebirth. It's also during this time that socialism enjoys rebirth among the young and the old. It's also during this time that liberalism and libertarianism have rebirth among the young and the old. So the period of the 50s and the 60s is a remarkable age, especially in the area of the politics of social systems. The radicals of the period run the full spectrum of views. In fact, there's very little agreement among the radicals. I thought it would be interesting to take a look at radicalism, more or less in the 60s, although there is some crossover with the early 70s and the late 50s, and take a look at the kinds of views that were operative in social life and in politics during this particular period, and then reflect at the end of all of that upon what radicalism does and doesn't mean, and finally take a look at what does, in some cases at least, become of the radical and radicalism as change is set in motion. Most of you remember, I suspect, people such as Tom Hayden and Herbert Marcuse. Marcuse is still writing and doing some lecturing. You'll recall the call for a complete rejuvenation of society by completely overthrowing the existing social political structures of the time. Most of us remember identifying quite quickly, if not intellectually, at least emotionally, with the ideas of Hayden and Marcuse. There was a sharp rise in interest in socialism, and at the same time a correspondingly sharp rise an interest in what we would call reactionary views in the area of politics and economics on the right. Ayn Rand was as attractive to her supporters as was Marcuse and Marx, as were Marcuse and Marx to their supporters. It was a rather curious mixture. The very same problems drew attention from radically different quarters, and of course the same problems drew radically different proposed solutions. The one group, the left, called for the introduction of socialist policies, the elimination of private property, the takeover of the industrial military complex by the people, the establishment of a legitimate proletariat. The right, while advocating individualism, called for a stronger centralized government. It preached the virtue of loyalty. It praised patriotism. And there were curious mixtures of views and values at this time. Some people on the right, while advocating a form of government which recognized the right of the individual to do as the individual pleases, short of doing damage to others, preaching strong individualism, also preached a strong centralized state, a state that would in effect maintain control in our society. So at one level, the people on the right would advocate that the individual should be free as the individual wills to act, especially in the marketplace. These are the proponents of Ayn Rand's views. At the same time, those same people advocate a form of government, when talking about patriotism and loyalty, which would be structurally diametrically opposed to the form of individualism they advocated in the area of economics. But nobody ever seemed to be terribly troubled by that. It's a curious thing about social activities in the 60s, both in the left and in the right sectors. The idea of being internally consistent was never an idea that took strong hold in either sector. That is a virtue among rationalists and among some empiricists, but the political activists of the 60s threw internal consistency to the wind. It made no difference whatsoever. So on the one hand, whether you were a liberal or a rightist, a leftist or a rightist, you might preach views which, as a matter of fact, are structurally opposed to one another. They have no shared kinship. As I was just saying, some people on the right especially would advocate economic views which were completely opposed to the views they advocated vis-a-vis the role of government in other areas of our social life. The same thing is true on the left. People in some sectors of our social life would advocate views which in other sectors are incompatible with the very same views they preached. The more interesting area, I think, in this period, that is, from the standpoint of a philosopher, is not social politics or social philosophy, but rather ethics. And there developed during the 60s some rather remarkable and striking ideas in the area of morality. If one looks at morality in a broad and narrow fashion, one can see different things happening simultaneously. Morality, as it shows up in the area of religion, experienced some interesting growth and developments. This is the period of time in which people such as Altizer and Hamilton are preaching the message that God is dead. At the same time, Billy James Hargis, in the Faith of Our Fathers movement, one can call it that, is advocating a kind of view which in effect reasserts the birth of God or resurrects God, the God of the past. It's the age of religious experimentation. One group saying, in effect, there's only one God. Another group saying there's any number of gods. It depends upon how you happen to get yourself up for communicating with that God. If you do it chemically, you might run into a scenario of gods, sometimes competing with one another for your attention. If you do it meditatively, you will run into one God, but if you do it meditatively in a correct fashion, you won't know when you've run into that one God, because when you do, there's nothing. So intellectually, there were curious things happening. Many, many gods were populating our society, some having traditional footholds and others not so traditional in the West, some having their origin in the East. There were people on street corners across from one another preaching counter messages, one group advocating a return to a fundamentalism of the sort associated with Christianity, another group advocating views that go back to the Oriental tradition. And all of this was happening in the same society, sometimes in the very same rooms, across the same common table. It was an era when experimentation in religion was considered to be, for a good many people, the most important kind of experimentation of the age. In the area of violence, morality underwent some significant changes. Most of you, I suspect, are familiar with William Sloane Coffin. Coffin Jr. is responsible for resurrecting the notion of militant non-violence. Mr. Coffin picked up the ideas of Albert Camus and Gandhi and reinserted into the 60s an old idea, namely that the human being has an integrity which no one can ever justify violating, and in effect, in his development of what became known as militant nonviolence, William Sloane Coffin and his followers attempted to develop and preach the view that there's something fundamentally sacred about being a human being, and it's the recognition of that sacred quality or element which rules out the possibility of the use of violence. Martin Luther King was active in the area, and it was clearly a period of time in which people were sorely troubled by being associated one way or the other with the old notion, sometimes confused with Marxism, namely that the end justifies the means. Like Lenin, many people were wondering at the time, if the end doesn't justify the means, then what does justify the means? It was an age which, insofar as violence is concerned, suffered from a persistent form of confusion. It appeared that the end people hoped to achieve was an end which in itself was clearly noble, but which was unattainable if in fact we were unwilling to use ignoble means. Others attempted to follow the path of nonviolence, and as a result of that attempt, led themselves and sometimes others to a sorry end. In the area of sexuality, there's the publication of Sexual Politics. It's an era of experimentation, as was true in the case of religion. It's the era in which women's liberation takes strong foothold in our society. It's the era in which gay liberation takes strong foothold. Sex now begins to have a social, economic, political dimension, not heretofore publicly recognized, and people become curious about themselves in a rather curious fashion. In the area of drugs, or in chemicals in general, we have such people as Timothy Leary on the scene, developing coteries, followers, advocating arriving at insight and vision concerning the nature of reality by means of chemicals, not otherwise, such insights, such visions not otherwise obtainable. A cult develops in this era. Before long, however, the sham of that particular development dissolves and becomes more serious, and people set into their own ways. Some put away the talk about drugs being a special way of discovering reality and settle down to socialized use of drugs. Drugs become a replacement for alcohol, in some cases tobacco. And now and then, since the 60s, there is an attempt to resurrect the talk of drugs allowing us some special insights into reality. That approach to the justification of the use of drugs continues. I suspect that insofar as drugs and morality are concerned, the most interesting thing about that particular era is the notion that somehow by way of drugs one can become more informed about oneself as well as reality around oneself. That kind of a claim has never been very carefully tested because that kind of a claim tends to be the most elusive type of metaphysical claim. A claim which in many cases was described as not being testable by the people making it. They didn't realize that they were describing it as not being testable, but when they argued that the only way you could test this claim is by going through the experience yourself, they were in effect ironically claiming that you couldn't test the claim at all, because if you go through the experience, there's no possible way in which you could test it. Racism and morality also had interesting developments. This is the period in which black power develops as a formal, conceptual approach to the situation of the black person in our society. People such as Stokely Carmichael and Carl Hamilton become very prominent. They develop behind them a powerful coterie, and there results from that development splinter groups which become equally significant. The Black Panthers, for example, eventually will evolve out of this development, and they still have a strong hold in some sectors of our society. Before long, once black power begins to evolve and the Panthers develop, they will also develop an interest in economics, and black socialism and black capitalism will develop at one and the same time. It's an interesting thing. I never bothered to read much about this particular era in the area of radicalism, but I thought, what the hell, it would be worthwhile to do a little reading before talking about the period. But when you go into the black sector, yeah, why not? It's a university. One should read now and then. It doesn't hurt if you don't do too much. But you can easily do too much, especially if you're in a department that offers nothing but multiple choice true-false exams. Everybody knows that. Yes, just read enough to pass. Otherwise you get confused. During this period of time, black socialism and black capitalism are equally powerful ways of conceiving the economic circumstance of the black person. And one and the same parties will, in different contexts, advocate the opposing views. So a person who is today a black socialist, if we were back in that period of time, might in a different context shift into a black capitalist mode. Because the decision as to which camp, to which tradition or which ideology you were going to fit in with was often a function of what was considered to be the most appropriate means for dealing with the problem in that context. And so I was surprised to find some people moving in the spectrum from socialism to capitalism and from capitalism back to socialism. Not always as a result of careful thinking, more often as a result of assessing the circumstance at the time as calling for such a shift. Another very interesting area in which radicalism is quite active and reaches eloquent expression in this period is in the area of the arts. I didn't know this, again, until I started to do some reading. But there is a publication known as Radical America, and one of the editors is Franklin Rosemont. And in an editorial in 1970, Rosemont wrote about the relationship of surrealism and the revolution being Marxist-Leninist revolution, defending surrealism as a way of expressing what the revolution is all about. Now, that's sort of a remarkable thing, because any of you who have worked in the area of Marxist-Leninism, especially if you've studied any the Soviet Union's history, East Germany's history, you're all familiar with social realism and the idea that art is to express directly what the circumstance of the human species is. So if you paint pictures, you leave no room for the interpretive ambiguities that normally go along with impressionism and what have you. So given that kind of a mindset, it's sort of natural to expect that you wouldn't find a Marxist-Leninist advocating and arguing that there's some kind of an internal, intimate connection between surrealism on the one hand and the Marxist-Leninist revolution on the other. Well, surprisingly, in Rosemont's editorial, that connection is discussed and claimed. That is, Rosemont argues, as I said a moment ago, that it's in surrealism one finds an especially effective aesthetic expression of the message of the revolution. And so the bourgeois attack on surrealism, the attempt on the part of the critics to classify surrealism as a decadent form of art, is interpreted by Rosemont as, in effect, the establishment's way of attacking the revolution. And so in this little editorial, one learns that if you identify with the proletariat, then in the area of aesthetics, the arts in general, you should be especially alert to the significance that surrealism has to play for the revolutionary. That's a remarkable piece, and you should read it. It's filled with a lot of the phrases that are sometimes get in the way and clutter your mind, but if you see past them, it's sort of a sharp shift from the old way of thinking of socialism, the revolution, and stark social realism in the arts. In the social sciences, perhaps the most interesting development isn't the rise of an idea, the occurrence of a movement, the genesis of an evolution. I think in the social sciences, the most interesting development comes in the case of the rise of certain people. Erich Hoffer has been around for a long time, but I think it's during this time that Erich Hoffer is especially interesting. He, I don't know if many of you are familiar with Erich Hoffer, but it's during this time that the piece, The Intellectual as Charlatan, is written. It's something everybody ought to read, especially college students. It's an especially valuable piece. It has the unsettling effect of making you somehow suspicious about the PhD and the BA and the MA in a way in which you aren't suspicious when you're a student. You are suspicious about those degrees as students, properly so. You know, it's not at all clear that they're worth what you pay for them, not in an economic sense, you know, but in a broader sense than that. But the suspicion that Hoffer generates concerning intellectual life and the intellectual is a more unsettling kind of suspicion. It isn't at all clear, you see, when you read Hoffer, and I don't think he's, at this point, can claim to be original. But nevertheless, it isn't at all clear when you've read Hoffer that the solution to our problem will come about by way of thinking it out. Hoffer is one of those people who, like Jean-Paul Sartre, would advocate that the solution to our problem is not through thought, but it's through action. But you have to be very careful with Eric Hoffer, because while he goes around in public, in his public speech and in his writings, putting himself off as something of an anti-intellectual, that bastard is every bit an intellectual. Anybody else in the university is. He's very much a social philosopher, very, very intensely engaged with his society in the most sophisticated and subtle conceptual fashion possible. In fact, the argument that our salvation is through action and not through thought is itself a very difficult position to sustain, but Hoffer does about as good a job as I've ever seen anyone do. He's well worth reading. It's also during this period of time that ideas associated with men such as B.F. Skinner become very, very attractive. And I'm sure you've read Walden too, and are familiar with Beyond Freedom and Dignity. Skinner's ideas are not new. The attempt to systematize them in novel form and then in more serious standard publication form for the academic world is new. He presents us the notion of the human being modifiable in behavior through the discovery of certain fundamental laws governing human behavior and the interconnections of humans with their environment. We are opened up to the possibility of scientifically bringing about utopia, and that has a curious and ironic attraction to us. Heretofore, utopianism was always considered to be utopianism because it wasn't realistic, but if it could be made realistic, it would no longer be pure utopianism. So it was rendered scientific by Skinner. And as a result, people began to wonder what kind of utopianism it was. If it's truly utopian, it couldn't be scientific. And if it's scientific, it couldn't be utopian. And Skinner attempts to effect a happy marriage between the two. There's a backlash to Skinner, of course. There is that long, deep-seated, generally recognizable as the humanist tradition group that rebels against the notion in the 60s as well as the early 70s that the human being is somehow structurally given to manipulation. Heretofore, we have always known that manipulation is possible, but we have been reluctant to accept the notion that manipulation is part and parcel of being a human being, and that scientific manipulation is the highest development and best expression of it. That idea is difficult for the humanist tradition to accept. There's still the desire to retain the old notion that there's something precious, unique, and individual, and basically uncontrollable by society or groups within it. And it's an attempt to reassert that image of the human being that at this point arises in reaction to Skinner. And that battle continues at the present time. The anti-Skinnerians trying to argue at different levels that there are good reasons for believing that Skinner's wrong, others arguing that if Skinner isn't wrong, we ought to have the sense enough to at least not let other people know that he's right. In the area of radical education, because the wrong people taking advantage of what Skinner has systematized in a so-called quasi-scientific manner could lead to certain kinds of chaos in our society for some, rigid control by others. In education, we have such strange people as Max Rafferty writing. Did anybody ever read Suffer Little Children? 1960s? This is a very interesting fellow. I remember Max Rafferty, but I never bothered to do much about that. So you should take a look at Suffer Little Children. It's worthwhile reading. This is a book in which Rafferty goes off on an obscene romantic binge and tries to convince us that what we need to do to education is bring back the hero, the noble individual, and educate our students, our youngsters, around such gigantic figures. And if we do that kind of thing, things will be set right in the schools and consequently, given the role of schools in society at large. It's a very nice thing to read. It's romantic. I wouldn't call it reactionary. I call it romantic because I think the assessment of the role of the hero, the noble act, the place of the noble act in our lives, I think Rafferty's assessment of all of that is clouded by a memory that's highly selective. It's like so many other things in life that are recalled from the past into the present. They never quite bring with them everything that originally went with them when first experienced in our lives. And I think that's how Rafferty brings the hero and the noble deed back into the 60s by leaving a good deal of the distasteful dimensions of those elements in the past where they were first experienced. This is the same period in which Ivan Illich is advocating the deschooling of our society, in which little buttons appeared. I have been deschooled. That's a very interesting development. Paul Goodman is writing Growing Up Absurd and a number of other very interesting things. It's a period in which, in the area of education, people are becoming gradually, in some cases not so gradually, convinced that the school is replacing the church, that the guardian of our morality, the traditional guardian of our morality, the church, could no longer do its traditional job, and that consequently we had to turn to a more reliable institution, and that became the church. To make things even more complicated, this is the period in which, on the one hand, people are in effect sanctifying the role of the school in our daily lives as a moralizing institution, moralizing in some kind of a literal sense. And at the same time, people are advocating that schools ought to include in the curricula they offer various important programs such as sex education. And here we have what is for the average American, the 20th century's most serious intellectual conundrum. And that is, how can you instill a profound, reliable sense of morality in young people and simultaneously teach them about sex? 99% of the American populace does not believe you can do both simultaneously to good advantage. And that continues to be a major problem in our society. We learn, that always baffled me, didn't it? Doesn't it strike you as strange? There are people, and a great many people, who don't think it's possible to teach morality and sex simultaneously, that you can't teach one and the other, that they are somehow structurally incompatible. In the 60s, that was very strongly believed. To make it even more complicated, the same people who held that belief argued that the only place in which one can give sex education is in the home. And if one examined our society closely and asked the question, in what context is there the greatest amount of confusion about sex, the answer would be in the home. That's the situation of an intellectually dwarfed society. Well, so much for a quick review of what was going on in this period. I haven't talked about any of the radicals, the real radicals, and what happened. I suppose most of you have followed people such as Che Guevara. Che had an unfortunate end. His life didn't end with a period, it ended with a series of dots. And that's always, historically, from the standpoint of the writers of history, that's an unbecoming end. But nevertheless, if you understand radicalism as the business of going to the root of the matter, the heart of the matter, and attempting thorough change in society or in some sector of it, I suppose the most obvious question is, why should one bother to be radical? For some, psychoanalytically, to be radical really means to attempt an external solution to an internal problem. And a great many people working in this area, trying to understand the occurrence of radicalism in different sectors of our society, hold to that response. The question, why be radical, is for them a psychoanalytic or a psychological question. And to understand its answer, one must understand the environment in which the radicalism occurs and the individual who purports or who intends to be radical. Here, the ultimate answer to the question is that we really don't know, because we don't understand ourselves and we don't understand the environment in which we emerge. Others argue that the answer to the question, why be radical, is to be found in understanding the evolutionary process of society. That is, radicalism is a necessary phase in the development of the species, whether that species be seen macrocosmically or microcosmically in the form of various social developments. The third answer to why be radical is in the form of a self-centered answer. Be radical because being radical is one way to have a good time. Interesting thing about this, in the 60s, some sociologists and social psychologists got very interested in the kinds of students and professors in universities who associated with the radical movement. They were interested in the apparent camaraderie that developed. They were interested in the way in which the radical movement seemed to make possible breaking down certain barriers that had traditionally heretofore existed between student and professor, between professor and worker and what have you. And among the people who have been questioned in the various sectors of studies that have been done, this isn't true in all those studies, but many studies report that when people are asked and interrogated very closely about their participation in various radical movements, the fact that the movement itself provided them a medium for entertainment, a medium for making social exchange and social interaction, which otherwise wouldn't have been available to them, is a very important fact. Radicalism made possible a form of social life which for some people would otherwise have been absent from their life. So it was a source of entertainment, a source of social intercourse, a source of enjoyment. And it wasn't always the case, apparently, that the movement or the particular expression of it at a given time had to succeed in its ostensive objective. The fact that we, for example, had met at a draft induction procedure where a bus was driven up to pick up a bunch of prospective inductees, people would stretch out in front of the bus, and the police would come along, or the military police would come along and move people out of the way, and the bus would carry on. The fact that the induction process was not eventually thwarted in that context didn't necessarily mean that one had been defeated. One still found that there was some source of enjoyment, some source of satisfaction realized as a result of participating in that activity. And even in that case, it wasn't always true for people that they could say, well, even though we didn't succeed in that particular instance of stopping the bus, eventually our activity did play a greater part in the larger context. Some people would argue that there was absolutely no connection between the greater context and the narrower context in which they were carrying out their particular concrete acts. They openly attest under interrogation to finding a certain kind of pleasure in that form of activity. There's another answer, of course, to becoming radical. Why become radical? For some means it's the only way, or the answer to that question is in the form of saying it's the only way to disengage from a form of life which is otherwise intolerable. Every society has within it an element, a sector in which the dropout move is the only reasonable move. And apparently for some who became part of the radical movement, they had to drop into the radical movement in order to drop out of the society with which they were having such great difficulty. Now, I think the best answer to the question, why be radical, is a historical question, and I'm really not prepared to answer that question, except to say this. It seems to me that it's in our own society, in Western so-called democracies in general, it's probably safe to say that there's no good reason why we should suppose that these societies will last indefinitely. That is, I suspect that like some of the great beasts of the past, our societies have outgrown the ability of their environment to support them. And subconsciously, our civilization is capable of sensing that fact. There is a disequilibrium between the capacity of the environment to support and the requirement of the organ to demand. We require a great deal from the world in which we live, given our form of civilization, and the world is becoming progressively less capable of providing what we demand. We're something like the brontosaurus, which may have become extinct because its environment could not respond adequately. Well, if that's, say, for the sake of discussion, theoretically possible, radicalism might be understood as one way in which the insight to that possibility gets expressed in a society. And ironically enough, that might mean that the true radical is not the one bent upon saving society, but the radical is the one bent upon making the message clear to society that its days are numbered. Radicalism is not destructive. History has its own way of carrying out destruction. It's simply a way of expressing the insight into the nature of history and the evolutionary process that characterizes it. I'm not sure about that. Some argue that in our society, radicalism is no longer functional. They won't deal with the kinds of speculation I have just spun for you. Rather, they're interested in trying to demonstrate that every form of so-called radicalism in our society is just that. It is so-called radicalism. And that's because in this society, in this civilization, we have allegedly run the gamut of all options open to us. We have tried moves on the left, we have tried moves on the right, and we have tried moves on the middle. We have had radical revolutionaries, radicals, liberals, stand-patists. We have had conservatives, rightists, and reactionaries. All forms of social organization have been attempted, none of them demonstrably superior to any other. In such a society, radicalism is structurally impossible, for there are no new alternatives to try. That view may itself be the ground out of which a new form of radicalism will be born. For there may in fact be now the birth of an attempt to show that true radicalism has not been neutralized by reason of the character of the development of our society, but that as a matter of fact, the development of our society calls for the birth of a new form of radicalism. And this is precisely where the leftists take off. They agree that we have tried all the options, but the options are defined by the narrowness of our structure, and to increase the options, one must alter the structure, and that, in effect, calls for revolution. Well, let's see. I was going to tell you a little bit about some people. I suppose you know that Stokely Carmichael, a so-called radical, is nicely settled down. He has something of a family. Eldridge Cleaver is making it back. Bernadette Devlin is sort of in the woodwork now. Somewhat politically active, but not significantly so. She's had trouble with the law. Tom Hayden is, we would call Tom Hayden sort of settled down. Jerry Rubin as well. Most of those radicals that we associate with the 60s at that level have fizzled out. The true radicals, such as Lenin and Marx and Gandhi and Martin Luther King, Marcuse, continue to work in one way or the other in radicalism. They have one advantage over many of the other radicals. They have the medium of literature to continue them on. Consequently, they have some kind of immortality built into the system of their ideas. That's all I'm going to say. Yeah?
Hasn't Jerry Rubin gone underground? That's hardly being settled down.
No, that's not. That's such a sedate form of life for Jerry Rubin now. There's nothing really active there at all. Yes. Yes. What do you suppose being on the ground means today? That means, I'm not sure about Jerry, but that can mean that you're tied into a very effectively organized rip-off agency so that you don't have to be employed. You have, in effect, picked up, who's the character in, who's the character who trains the little boys? Yes, yes, yes. There are all kinds of Fagans operating in the so-called underground. That's a lot of... You have to be very careful about what going underground means. Oh, it's very fashionable. I suppose if you live in Ames, Iowa, For 75 or 80% of the people living in our society, especially in Ames, it is sort of wild. But if you go on the other side, that's not wild at all. There are two levels to our society.
Largemont in a $90,000 house, that's what I was pointing out. I mean,
Well,
you can say
that's not middle class, I suppose, but he's not anything like he was as a politician or as a political activist.
no, he is, he can't be active.
In fact, he wrote, let's see, I read a thing
Some
in
articles
which
came out about a year ago in
he
the
talked
Times.
about some of his past experiences and put them in new colors and new shapes and new forms. And if you remember that stuff, you've got to say the guy has sort of calcified. Things are gone, dead, burned out. Nothing much happening there. It's very hard in the U.S. to be a radical. Very difficult. Everything that's radical gets institutionalized so quickly. Yes. 15 years ago on the campus at Iowa State, the rip-off mode of economic support was radical. To support yourself through being tied into a rip-off network would have been very, very unusual, would have been very, very radical. Today, the number of people that survive through being tied into a rip-off network, that's common. Living off theft of one form or another is just another way of making a living in our society now. No, politicians do it, industrialists do it, all forms in our society do it. So, you see, that was radical at one time, and this happens so quickly. A new way of doing things gets absorbed, which happened in that case. I didn't realize that, but you know, those of you who know the student life, talk to students, live with students, what have you, I'm just amazed at how institutionalized the ripoff is. Not just in the student sector, but through society as a whole, at every sector. It's so commonplace. Yeah.
I don't really grasp what you mean when you say the rip-off.
Well, you make a living, support yourself by what we would traditionally call through cheating, through being dishonest, through theft of one form or the other. That's very common now.
The relative difference between now and 10 years ago or whatever, you would substantiate that in terms of the student. I know more about the student life.
Yes, I think it can be substantiated by simply taking a look at the kind of insurance that the insurance companies are beginning to ask to provide insurance for loss, and also by the amount of money that's going into internal security for stores and things like that. Reading the ink blotter down at the what the hell do they call it at Chicago? We call it the blotter. You know, at the police station, keeping tabs on the records. I'm pretty sure that in that sector, the data is very, very clear, but even more important, I suppose, is that for the society at large, the data is even clearer. The amount of corporate theft that goes on in our society is phenomenal. And I think the reason for its being so drastically increased is not simply a function of people becoming just more corroded, but the complexity of our industry and commercial sectors make it much more possible now. It's much easier to conceal crime of that sort. How many are students in the room? It's a tough question to ask, but is there anybody who's a student in the room who is not daily connected in some way or another to the rip-off activity? You don't encounter it in one way or the other? You don't run into someone who has ripped something off? You know about it? A good many of you are, aren't you? Have ties in around the campus, are familiar with things being ripped off as a rather commonplace thing? The evidence is very clear. The books, the coats, the things that disappear from are just phenomenal.
You'll find it a lot more in larger cities than in Ames.
Yeah, I'm sure there'll be more of it in larger cities, but it's widespread here on campus too. The amount of unreported theft on this campus is very, very important. People just get fed up with even bothering. Even academic units in the campus don't bother to report anymore. Yes?
I'm disagreeing with you that you feel this a great change. Certainly.
I don't know if it's a great change on a continuum. I would say over a 25-year period it is a great change. I unfortunately have, but I wouldn't use that as an authority.
I know this much.
Memory is hardly a substitute for reason at this point. I think the evidence is there.
I seldom lock my bicycle. No one's stolen it in 5 years. I never.
Keep it up, sweetheart, and you'll find out. I mean,
not
that's
denying
naive. That's very naive.
Perhaps. But I
Check in
also,
with the local police and the campus police on the number of bicycle thefts in the last 3 years, and I wager that the next time you leave your bicycle unlocked, you will also think of yourself as something less than rational.
Sure, but if you ask the police the same question and you phrase it differently, what is the bicycle theft relative to the number of bicycles, they will hesitate to say. At least that was my experience.
Yes, I think they'll hesitate on most any question you ask.
I mean, clearly defined that the student sector
I don't think,
is clearly living on the rip-off system.
I don't mean to single out let me make 2 comments in reply. I don't mean to single out the student sector as unique. What goes on in the student sector is microcosmically a representation of what goes on in society at large. The role of the rip-off is, as far as I'm concerned, structurally the same at all levels in our society. The idea of supporting oneself through some form of theft is an idea that's very widespread in society, and it exists quite plainly, quite openly within the student population as well as within other populations in our society. That's all I would, that's the first thing. Second thing, this is a more significant factor today, much more significant factor, not just statistically. I think that's the least interesting thing to say about it. But I think it's very, very significant vis-a-vis what it says about the psychology and the mindset of the individuals living within our society. Being complacent in the face of dishonesty is a feature, it seems to me, which is probably, on a widespread spread basis, is probably one of the features one could expect to find in a civilization which is on the decline. And I suspect that's what one has to worry about, you see. I'm shocked at how superficial the talk about the return to morality is. I suspect it's just the other way around. So that it's in that context. Now, that's what would bother me most. I think that's the real problem. And I wouldn't lay it all on students.
I was trying to phrase it in routing terms. I'm sure that there's always been theft. But there's surely going to be an ebb and flow. You know, and the cyclical, I doubt it will remain constant all the time.
I think one can show, though, through just reading the laws that are being written governing insurance, through all of these things, one can see that the phenomenon of theft is becoming an institution in our society, not just in the sense that we have to have a mechanism for dealing with it, but that we're actually developing mechanisms for acknowledging it, but not in just a preventative way. You just acknowledge that there's going to be so much theft, and you take insurance precautions and what have you for it. Now, when that happens in a society, you have institutionalized this business of, well, everybody does it sometime or another, or every now and then you get into bad ways, you know, and everybody makes a slip. When you make that move, that's a significant alteration in the character of a society. Because that's a form of complacency, which it strikes me as an indication that we really are slipping down rather than moving at a level or moving up. Do you understand me?
Yes, I just don't agree. I think that is good so far as it goes. I just don't think it addresses the question sufficiently. I think it's much
It may
broader
not.
than that. I think you could focus on that and make a very good argument. But I think if you extend the argument.
How would you extend? What would you do?
Well, for example, we could say that we have institutionalized theft in one sense, but we don't, let's not call it theft. Let's call it concern for the collective environment. We are considering land use planning in this country, in this county, in the state, etc. That what belongs to the individual is a private right, or, you know, we assume that private property really is a bundle of rights. But we may have to take some of those away from an individual and give them to society because we become more and more complex. The population density grows, etc. Now, is that theft? I mean, in the sense
I think that's a very significant type of issue you raise, but I think I would hesitate to play now with whether that should be defined as theft.
Perhaps there's a
I think that's not productive.
That there's less respect for material goods. or that we should have more equality or equity. And I certainly don't defend the mechanism, but maybe that's not a wrong opinion.
Well, some people who I think are conceptually fouled up have tried to argue that the increase in theft in our society is simply a way that the people have of expressing the notion that private property is an asocial idea. Now, frankly, I think that's bullshit. And anybody who thinks that way thinks with a lot of cotton in their head. That's a way to escape that's just intolerable in a halfway decent intellectual setting where reason has some right to rule.
I've seen an analysis, a journal article that argued, this was an economics journal article, saying that argued in terms of trade, that if the private individuals give up a certain number of rights to the government or some collective agency, what they will receive will be more than what they kept for themselves. Now that's obviously true in terms of a road or education. And he was arguing that as we move toward a more complex society, that is what we will do more and more often, because society becomes more interrelated. We must have mass communications, for example, to do many of the things we do.
Yeah.
We must have transportation. But that might be a byproduct. I don't necessarily disagree with it.
Well, I think this takes us off on a set of issues that are very significant issues that I'm not even prepared to deal with the one I'm working with, let alone deal with that one. I would just like to leave it the way I've put it now. My concern is that we have institutionalized in a new way certain practices, and it's that form of institutionalizing those practices that strikes me as most troublesome. We have accommodated ourselves to theft and other forms of dishonesty in such a fashion that we accept it as part of our day-to-day life, which it strikes me is a very serious character crack in our civilization. I don't quite know how to respond to it.
I think part of this could be anonymity of the city. White-collar employees in one recent year stole $5 billion away from their employers.
Yeah.
The equity funding scandal. But I want to go back to what I think you're trying to say. What else in the radicals have we accepted? And I've been thinking here the change in lifestyle, clothing, and some of these other things.
Yes.
And the civil rights movement, and are there not other areas you want to move on to for the acceptance of the radical ideas?
Oh, yes. I would say there are a number of, pardon me?
Really co-opted in a way.
Oh, yes. I haven't checked on this, so I just surmise this now. But I would guess that leading manufacturers in the area of clothing, personal care items, so on and so forth, have increased the number of different things they carry in individual lines of products. Far over, that's a great increase over what they were doing 10, 15 years ago, because being different has turned out to be marketable. So there's at the same time, through slick advertising, they have discovered ways to get a great many people to do the same thing and believe that they're being different. I would think that's one of the keys. That's one of the keys to the success of the commercial enterprises in our society. The people bought that. So from the standpoint of radicals, the courage to be different, the courage to vary consciously from the establishment is a form that has shown up in other areas of life now. You see, well, people wearing, 10 years ago, started wearing the broader ties and growing beards and things like this. Women had different style changes, and it became commonplace. When you see a president, the wife of a president of some university wearing a certain style today, why, that's not unusual at all. Well, 10 years ago, that would have been unusual. You know? A certain kind of openness, lack of fear, that I think the radicals injected into our society, and it became institutionalized. I think psychologically, the radicals have given us a much more sensitive feel for the insight that something fundamental is not right. That's easy to read that in a textbook if you're studying Marx or something like this. But I think the radical era, the 60s, made it much easier for people to be conceptually in control of this idea. Not just to feel that there's something not right, but I think people have become more articulate in being able to express what they think is not right. And I think the radicals helped break the bondage here that held us back from saying what we thought wasn't right. At first they did it through language. Remember that, the four-letter word era? They'd say, shit. And that was such a symbol for us. It was a remarkable thing. And before long, it just was commonplace. You know, if you said shit, I'm glad my wife isn't here. If you said shit 5 years ago, 6, 10 years ago, you really get yourself in trouble. But that kind of an attitude about language carried over into a number of sectors of society. And I think that was a form of contribution. The radicals didn't have that in mind, liberation through profanity or stuff like that, but I think it had a beneficial effect.
Yeah, now, you were citing William Sloane Coffin as a radical because of the really...
He's not really, I don't
No,
think so.
he's not, right? I mean, that's a perfect
He was,
example of an idea.
in
which
books
has
on
not
radicalism,
become-
he is.
Well, all right, his ideas, I think, are perfect examples of ideas which have not become institutionalized and which have not spread
Yeah.
widely throughout society.
Well, I think that you raise a very interesting point at this point. I think the really significant ideas in the 60s that were associated with the radicals that didn't get woven into the fabric of our society are ideas which had their birth well before the period of the 60s. For example, the notion of the individual as having an inviolable integrity. Yeah, that's very, very old. It was resurrected by Camus in the 50s and then picked up by people in the 60s. But that's an old, old idea. The message of love is an old, old idea. All of those ideas, it seems to me, which are really important ones and which didn't get lasting, durable foothold during the 60s, came into place well before the 60s. But that doesn't mean all of the ideas that did catch on are somehow superficial. I think the liberation that was brought about through the attack on language is a profound form of liberation. It's absolutely profound for people to become properly cynical about the grip that language is allowed to have on them. You know, the tyranny of language is a tyranny which no free society can accept. And I think the four-letter word era really played that up.
Well, what do you think some of these ideas did become accepted in our society, and others are still pretty...
Well, you know, that's very hard to figure out. A Marxist would say that the ideas which take hold are those which have sort of a natural economic dimension to them, which render them easily incorporable into the existing socioeconomic political structures. So that, to put it simply, if you can make a profit from the idea, it gets a very easy, very quick hearing. So, you know, pardon me?
There's no profit from my saying.
Oh, well, but you see, that's another thing. There, well, as a matter of fact, psychoanalytically, I would wager against you at this point.
Yeah, I would argue in that.
It did profit you.
Talk about economic profits.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't want to play with words.
I think that this is one reason. I don't know the answer to that question.
Language and so on aren't, I don't think they're trying to get economic.
Oh, yes. My goodness sakes. Do you realize that the value of string stock has now gone up in this country 350%? Because using strings, you can now create the baggy look by the latest style. You tie strings around like this and you walk around with a kind of modified pantaloon. As soon as that happens, a string is worth a hell of a lot more than it was the day before. Silly little things.
Well, couldn't you say that civil rights was accepted in the South because it was no longer economically feasible to exploit the blacks?
Yes, sure. It would have been a disaster to persist. And they're able to survive economically because they did recognize civil rights couldn't be dismissed. It had to be taken seriously. Probably was taken more seriously in the South than in the North, ironically. Yes? Were you going to say something, Dwight?
I was going to ask you if you felt that the radicals they had made us aware of some things, as you said. They stood at look at society saying, you know, don't necessarily want to change, but we want to make the rest of you aware of what's going on. And are you
I
saying
think
then-
so. I think a
That's
number of,
That's what you said, correctly?
yeah, yeah.
All right. Now, if society says, well, perhaps you have a point, and then they accept some of the viewpoints of radicals and they institutionalize these viewpoints, such as, I would use an example of student discontent about the market society as reflected by Iceberg, or Common Cause on a national level, perhaps being made aware by, say, Jim Hightower and Ralph Nader, but then actually more has been done probably by the Sierra Club and Common Cause, yet none of us, I don't think, could name the leaders of the latter. Yet you don't, I think we think of Ralph Nader as an individual. I mean, I think he made an impact 10 years ago, but what he has really done and does work now, but others have come and gone to the courts, have testified, etc. Now, is that what you mean by institutionalizing, perhaps with the
Yes,
Carmichael,
that's-
etc.?
Yes, that's one way in which,
More
yes,
now.
yes.
Well, does that
Yeah.
mean that radicalism does not exist, or that we do not think of it as
Well,
personalities?
what is originally regarded as a radical idea or a radical activity becomes, when it's institutionalized, no longer radical.
So are you saying it's a stair-step evolution? We go up, then we go over, and then
I speculate at that point. It appears that it happens in this fashion. I can't find the right analogy or the right metaphor to use, but a society finds itself in serious situations from time to time in which the flow, the dynamic of its institutions becomes clogged. Things are jangled and disheveled, and dramatic, radical moves are sometimes necessary to break the system free, to get it flowing again. And radicalism serves the function of being something of a purgative at that point. Another thing I think that radicalism in the 60s did for us that's beneficial, at least for some people and in some cases some institutions in our society, and that was to make us take very seriously the rage of others. You know, before then, we were, I would say, complacent and indifferent to the rage of others. The 60s turned that around, and the effect of that is the alteration of law, the alteration of institutions by way of law. And I think that's a profound change to take place. What's frustrating is that it's one thing for a people to finally take seriously the rage of another person, but to be in a position in which there is no effective way of expressing the fact that you want to take it seriously. It's very, very hard to do that. You know, it's a striking thing, and most people, I suspect, in the Midwest think that things have changed a lot in some parts of the world, some parts of our society. They haven't. You know, when you go into Chicago, Jesus, it's amazing how some parts of Chicago have changed, but only for the worse. You know, and here people have been thinking, well, somehow things are being taken care of, they're being done. Well, you discover that it's one thing to be serious about the rage of others, it's another thing to find a way to make that a difference, and it doesn't always happen. Yes?
I have an impression that, in looking back at the 60s, that one of the real strong characteristics of radicals was their internal consistency. And well, I think of Mario Savio and others who seem to have such a clarity about their thinking about the implications of institutions that...
Frankly, I think that if you take a look at their actions and their words, the consistency is very difficult to maintain. Very difficult. One of the peculiar habits of many of the people who participated, Savio, Oglesby, Carmichael, a number of these, Tom Hayden, in their discussions, it was very, very difficult, frequently, to get any kind of reliable acknowledgement that it made a difference to be consistent, that it made a difference to check out the logical impeccability of a chain of reasoning. You know? Many of the radicals in this period got caught up in the notion that thought